Okay, so the cement has set on the straps, and I'm going to cut these out, and that's what's next. So I'll spare you video on that, and we'll move on to the next step after I get these cut out. Okay, so we've got the thongs cut out, and you can see the liner on the back side. And one key to this, to getting your liner to cut really clean, is to keep your knife sharp, which I've mentioned in my strop video or my bevel sharpening video. I keep a strop handy, and this is just a piece of leather that I put some neat's foot oil on, and after the neat's foot dried, I rubbed it with jeweler's rouge, which any kind of buffing compound probably would get the job done. I've always used green compound until this last couple weeks. I've been experimenting with jeweler's rouge, and it seems to be working just fine. There's not a noticeable difference to me between a couple of different compounds I use, as far as stropping goes anyways. Anyway, so next I've got my cuts as clean as I can get them, and from here I will sand the edges flat and try to get everything perfectly square. And for that I use my sanding block. I use my marble slab with the adhesive paper, which I use a little brush to keep it from loading up and clean it off pretty often, just a little nylon brush. And for those hard to reach places, like way up inside the angle here, I'll use this popsicle stick that has the same adhesive paper, and just use it to get it flat. And that's what I do next. Okay, at this point in the process, it's time to start thinking about stitching lines. And in my video and on my previous flip-flops, what you would see me do is use the stitching groover to make a groove around the entire thong and trace that all the way around. And that basically allows me to recess my stitching into the thong straps. And what that means is the stitching will be almost flat when you rub your finger across the top, which keeps it from rubbing against other surfaces and wearing through the thread over time. So that's what I typically do. Another option, something to think about, the stitching groover cuts through what is the strongest part of the leather, which is the top flesh side, and you don't want to do that typically. You want to avoid doing that. You can groove from the grain all you want to a point, but that the strength is all in the outer layer. So I've kind of been battling with whether or not I'll continue using the stitching groover to do this. The other option would be to use a compass of some kind. This is just a cheap compass I got from Harbor Freight, like a 6-inch. And what you can do is you can dampen or case your leather, and then you can go with the compass and you can mark your stitching line without actually cutting, and then you can go through and punch your holes for stitching and go that route, which is probably what I'm going to do on these, because I am kind of trying to move away from the groover, even though I really love using the groover and I really like the way it looks. I've just been kind of debating that in my head, whether or not I would continue doing it. So anyway, I'll probably use the compass on this go and see how that turns out, and we'll go from there. Stitch it between about 3/16 is where I set it at. You can do it whatever you like visually. I do use this granite slab on purpose. I feel like it helps the compass move more smoothly. It tends to catch in uneven surfaces with those points, so it's something to consider. It just helps it skate across the surface. So I've got both sides grooved with my compass, which I'm pretty happy with the results. It's still going to be effectively recessing the stitch, but it's not cutting through that outer layer, and that's what we want. Next, I use my touch mark, and one thing you want to do if you use a touch mark is think about how you want the thong to look with the touch mark. I like to put mine on the outside edge, and after this point, you've designated a right and a left unless you've done them both on the same side, so keep that in mind. So what I'll do is I'll mark this one and mark this one, and what I use is another cheap tool. This is like a dead blow hammer from Harbor Freight. This one's 2 pounds. I think they make a 1, 2, and 3 pounder. And for touch marks, it really seems to give it a nice dead, even blow. And so that's what I like to use. And I'm a big fan. As opposed to like a rawhide or wood or something, it might be a little bit more of a bounce to it. This is something you want to get right the first time. And if you do use a touch mark, you can't just, well, for me, I'm hitting it, which is, there's other options than just striking it. You can actually get some that you can use in a press, which would probably be more consistent. But when I use it, I rock it a little bit in every direction to make sure I get the depth where it needs to be. Otherwise, you could be a little bit off and it'll be deep on one side and then light on the other, almost to the point where you can't read it sometimes. So it's kind of a tricky thing to do. But I'll go ahead and line it up in the general area that I like. And that'll work. Kind of going a bit of a circle and a dead flat. And there's my mark. My wife is not a fan of my maker's mark, so I hope to get a new one pretty soon. But anyway, I'll go ahead and mark this other one and we'll move on. There's a few different options you have when it comes to punching your stitching holes. What I typically use are these diamond-shaped awls, and it comes in a set. They have different spacings that you could try out, and what I use is the tightest spaced one. I think it's like 1/8 of an inch or something along those lines. Or maybe it's a 2 millimeter. I don't know what the smallest size is, but it's the craft tool set, and I basically just punch all the way through and trace that around. The set comes with different heads. So in certain spaces I'll have to switch to maybe the 1 or the 2 bit punch just to make the turns, like this area right here. This will probably require like the 2 or the 4 to get through there. You also want to plan out your stitching. It's probably best to punch from the center and then work your way out, because you may end up, the spacing of your stitching lines, if you start them this way, you can terminate them on the ends where you're not going to see them, versus where if you start on the ends where you're not going to see that anyway, and then you end it in a way that you don't like up here, you have to look at it. So another thing you could use is a stitching wheel like this one, and you could just run that along your grooves, and that'll mark your points where you could space your stitching out the way you want, and then you can go back through with an awl and you could punch those holes out by hand. Especially with one layer of leather like this, it's not too bad to do. What I typically use is a round awl. This one right here, I use it for pretty much everything, but what's more typical is the diamond awl, and if you have to start to choose one or the other, probably get used to using the diamond awl, because that's something I'm having to overcome, just a bad habit. I probably need to be using the diamond awl more often. But anyway, I'm going to go ahead and mark my stitching holes. Another thing you could do, if I didn't mention this already, is use a drill press. You could use this stitching wheel to mark your holes, take it over to your drill press, and drill, 1/16 or 1/32 holes would probably work just fine. But I don't plan to do that for this particular application, so I'll go ahead and use my punch to just drive it all the way through, and we'll go from there. Another tip would be keep your tools waxed or oiled, and this process will be a lot easier. But here's what it looks like punch through, which you may not be a fan of, or you may think it's just fine, but that's your preference. That's why there's different ways to do this. But this is how I'll do it on this particular task. But anyway, to keep this video from being excessively long, you get the idea. On this particular layout, I punched this first because it's the center, and I'll be looking at that. Well, maybe not looking at it because it'll be under the thong, but I want to start there and work my way out, and I'll spare you guys the video. So we've got the stitching holes all punched. If you'll remember, I used the 4-prong punch to start here, and that was from there I went straight out to the ends with the 6-prong. And then up here, this little curve was a little bit tricky to get into, so I used the single-prong punch, and then from there I used the long 6-prong punch from there. So at this point, I typically will die, and we use whatever finish I want to use on these, and then I will go and sew, and then after sewing I'll burnish. And the reason for that is it's probably not critical, but I feel like when you're burnishing and working on these edges, you're fighting your stitching holes, and then after you've sewn you might have bumps on your burnished edges, whereas the last thing I want to do is burnish so I can make sure that everything's flat, slick, and smooth on the edges. On these I just do a regular burnish like you've seen before in my last videos. I'll wet the edge, I'll burnish it by hand or with my Dremel, then I'll use my gum tragacanth, burnish it again, and then finish with beeswax and burnish it again. Another thing I've considered, which I haven't done, is using a product called Edge Coat, and that would give me a nice clean finish. You prep just like you would you would go through your burnishing process, but then you would finish with a nice edge coat, which is like a durable paint that you can put on the edges. And for this, that might be a way to go, because the pigskin liner, if you see closely, has a bit of a white color to it, and it can be tricky to burnish that. So just options for you. I'm going to just go through my normal process, but I thought I would throw that out there. If you don't like the look of that edge, you can always try an edge coat, and that opens you up to a lot of different color options. You could use, not just brown or black, but you could use green or red or different colors. So I'll throw that out there. And then next up, I'm going to go ahead and put some dye on these. So the reason I want to dye before I sew is because if you sew first, you can get dye on your threads, and there's nothing worse than white thread with brown dye smeared all over it, which it feels unavoidable in this situation, because I have to sew this before I dye, or at least I feel like I do. I probably could rethink how I'm doing that, but I just, in my mind, I'd already decided that I have to do it this way. But you could probably plan to change that, but you don't see that stitch as much as you would the others anyway. It's between your toes, for crying out loud, so that's pretty nitpicky. But anyway, I'll move on to getting some dye on these, sew them, and then burnish.